So welcome to this week's Lovefly Podcast. Today we're joined by Chris Shaffer. Hopefully I got that pronounced right. Yes. And Chris has got a hell of a story to tell. So welcome to the podcast, Chris. Thank you.
Hey, Paul, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So tell us about yourself. Tell us where you are in the world and how you came to be here, basically.
Sure. So again, my name's Chris. I'm from the Midwest here in the United States, from Indiana, about 3 hours south of Chicago. I find that usually helps the European folks kind of position me geographically. But yeah, so the long and short of the story is that I was a nervous flyer for the last 10 years or so of my life. Felt that it was really restricting a lot of my options in life. And I turned 35 this year and decided I'm done with it.
Wow. Okay, that's great. That's like a lovely, I wish everyone would do that. That's such a lovely little snapshot. Okay. So you said for 10 years. So presumably then you were either flying before that, or you decided at 25, I don't like flying, and you hadn't flown. So let's tell us about the history of the fear, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So it's hard. I tried to kind of break this down into chunks, and this is kind of the best I was able to make sense of it. So back when I was younger, and maybe before I was a teenager, my family used to fly all the time. We had relatives down in Florida, not a huge flight, but maybe 5-6 hours down there. We used to go all the time. I don't remember a time in my youth where I wasn't flying down there. When I reached teenage years, I got a little bit more involved with school. Academics started being a little bit more of a lift. So we took family trips, but they weren't as regular.
Okay.
And then at some point during college, I think I had just kind of gotten out of the practice of flying, if that makes any sense. And when I was 21 or 22, I got on a plane to go out to Boston to visit a friend in college, and I realized, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can do this anymore.
Oh, wow. So what was going on then that sort of triggered that, do you think? I mean, apart from being out of the habit of it.
I think it was a combination of things. Not to bring this dark, but I experienced a decent amount of loss in my life. Grandparents, my father passed away when I was younger. So it was kind of a combination of this sort of swelling idea that people don't need to be around for a while. And that sort of just cemented into this weird fear that, maybe there are things out there that aren't super safe for me to do. Sure. And for some reason, flying became one of those for me.
Okay, so there was a whole bunch of stuff going on there that's the tough side of life is impacted upon you and maybe filtered through to flying. So you did that flight to Boston, and did you do the flight, or did you kind of have to get off? What happened there?
I did the flights, and I was actually able to take one more flight after that. At the age of 23, I flew out to LA to go visit one of my friends who had just moved out there. One of my best friends in the world. Definitely wanted to, make sure that we still saw each other, despite the fact that we were many, hundreds of miles away.
By the way, if you've got other friends that are going to listen to this, there may be some jealousy. They just got labeled best friend. So just putting it out there, if you wanted to correct, now would be a good time.
I'll go on record. Definitely one of my best buddies. So I flew out there, had a wonderful time, and then on the way back I had a connecting flight from LA to Las Vegas. And on the way into Las Vegas, the pilot came over and said, hey, I was speaking to the pilots in front of us. There have been some wildfires on the ground, so pushing up a lot of turbulent air. Okay. So just strap in, be ready for it. And for some reason, that just set me off. I started panicking.
Instantly, sort of that was it. But even before the turbulence arrived, you started having some. Yeah.
The funny thing is, I remember the pilot coming over and saying that. I don't remember anything about the bumpiness at all. I don't know if there even was any bumpiness. It was just the notion of, hey, we're going to hit something unexpected, strap in for it.
Yeah.
So the brain goes to some pretty scary places when things crop up like that. So needless to say, I made it home alone, but that was sort of the final straw for me at the age of 23. I thought, maybe flying's just not for me anymore.
Right. And so when you say maybe, is that what happened?
It is.
So it wasn't maybe at all. You just stopped.
I just stopped. I did shift though. For a long time I felt, this is not going to impact my quality of life. I'm still going to take trips, but I'm going to start driving out there. So cue about 10 years of just really horrifically long drives. I drove maybe 12, 14 hours to go visit
I was going
friends
to
and
ask that,
family.
Chris. So 12, 14.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's, you can rationalize it in the time, but looking back, it's pretty obvious how your life gets affected when you decide that you're not going to do things like get on airplanes anymore.
Yeah. So just out of interest then, so aside from that massive driving, what other impact did it have?
It was really just this notion of I'm not able to do this. I put myself in a box. And I think that kind of manifested itself in a lot of ways. I just kind of felt like a less capable person. I felt like there was kind of this fear that was baked into me. And for a really long time, it did lessen my self-esteem.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why when I turned 35, I kind of looked at myself in the mirror and said, I don't want to live my life like this anymore. I want confidence. It wasn't just about, going to different places of the world. It was really like looking at my own reflection and saying, I would like to change something major about this. And that's kind of how it started.
Yeah. So you had 10 years of just driving, avoiding. Yeah. Anybody else has this impacted upon? Were you just carrying the whole burden of this missing the flights?
My family really rallied around me, and they made it just kind of the understood notion that if trips are going to happen, it's going to take a little while longer. We're going to hop in the car, and it's tensions tend to run high when you're in the car with somebody for 14 hours, even if you've known them for their entire life. So yeah, there were definitely some of my personal relationships were affected by that. So thank you to all the people who put up with me for that period of my life. It was tough.
And yes, I mean, it's nice to have, it's always a tricky one, isn't it? Because it's great to have that support base. People sort of get it and they go, fine, we're not going to fly, we'll drive here, or we'll just miss out on those particular opportunities. But there comes a point where that sort of support wears thin, I imagine.
Yes. Yeah, it's the support, like you said, is great. But when you've already sort of drawn the box around yourself and other people kind of, highlight over it, it really does cement that notion that, okay, this is just, a limitation that we're all going to have to deal with.
So, yeah, so that's an interest. So it's always worth sort of like thinking about the impact, how it sort of like ripples out to others. So what was your, I don't know if this is the right phrase, but what was your belief system around flying then during that 10 years in terms of safety or peril that you could be in or whatever? What were you telling yourself?
I think the main thing that I was telling myself is that, as silly as it sounds now, it's that if I set foot on an airplane, there is no guarantee that I will set foot off that airplane. So it really felt like a matter of life and death for me. I'm a very analytical person when it comes to, when I want something to be a part of my life, I really kind of analyze it, hold it, move it around, and really try to understand it from a basic fundamental level. And once the fear really set in, that was the last thing that I wanted to do with flying.
Yeah.
So part of overcoming it for me was just learning about it.
Yeah, let's not go to, we'll go to that in a minute. We want to know about all that. We want to enjoy the story. So, because what we're trying to do is build a picture in people's minds as they're listening, thinking, because you make it sound a bit too easy otherwise, and it obviously wasn't. Otherwise, you wouldn't have avoided it for so long. So for 10 years, you're driving these hideous journeys with the support, which obviously we've established that sometimes that might have been a little bit tested on the longer journeys. And did it have any impact in terms of your work or any other sort of lifestyle choices that you had to make?
There were definitely times where I think that travel would have been possible for me professionally, but I got passed over because they thought, oh, Chris would never go out there.
Right.
It's we can't just toss him in the car. We'd have to get on a plane. So let's
Mm,
keep him grounded. The major way that it manifested itself for me was I'm a pretty calm person, don't have a lot of major fears in my life, but
yes.
without fail, the only nightmares that I ever had from that 10-year period were all about flying.
Yeah.
It was either being in an airport, it was, being in line to board the plane, it was actually being in the
Mm,
cabin.
mm.
And I would just wake up some nights in cold sweats just
Oh,
about the
wow.
idea
Yeah.
of going around anything related to flying.
Yeah. So your idea then, because you said earlier, you'd step on a plane, step foot on a plane, but you wouldn't be able to step off. So, to spell it out then, what was your kind of scenario or scenarios that you thought would happen to you?
I think that the brain just goes to extremes. There's going to be an explosion. Someone's going to try to take over the plane. Just this
Mm,
notion that something unknown could happen to me and I would die up there in the air or in some fiery, awful Hollywood crash.
mm.
Uh,
So you were quite good then at running this sort of these disaster movies, weren't you, in your head?
I work in marketing, so I can kind of sell myself any idea.
Ah, okay, interesting. Yeah, so you're creative then. That's not helpful, it turns out, in your 10 years. All right, so that's really interesting. Okay, so what was the decision? What happened at 35 that made you go, enough is enough, and then talk us through the process. And
Sure.
don't skip
So
over any steps because we want all the wisdom. All right, Chris.
Sure. There's two things. So let's start chronologically. So last year, I had the chance to take a trip.
Mm,
My girlfriend at the time was working for a company out in Vermont, which I had previously driven to, but it really didn't make sense to drive out there. So we decided to get on a plane. It was my first time even going inside of an airport in about a decade.
yes.
Um, and the entire time leading up, I had been telling her, this is my number one fear. This is going to be really bad. I don't know if I can really do this.
Mm, mm,
And by the time we boarded the plane, I was full on sobbing, just tears running down my
yeah.
face.
Yeah.
I had, clicked myself into my seatbelt, pulled it tight,
Mm,
just in case that would help in case of emergency. And I remember looking over and my girlfriend just had this horrified look on her face like, oh no, he really wasn't lying about this. This
yes.
is I thought that, maybe he was a little bit uncomfortable on planes, but
Mm,
this is a full-blown panic attack that's happening
yeah.
here. So that was
Was she able to
probably
help at all? Or was she just so shocked she didn't know what to do?
there was definitely some shock. She was very helpful, though. What I ended up doing, this was, I had no plan going into it aside from fingers crossed. What I ended up doing was just talking her ear off for the entire flight.
Mm,
I thought that if I kept my mouth moving, that I could keep my brain from going to those horrible, scary places. So
okay. Yeah.
for the 2-hour flight, I really just gabbed on about anything that made sense at the time. So it was it was not a pleasant experience for
No.
her.
No.
And for me, it was just trying to stave off this kind of creeping shadow in the back of my mind.
Mm,
I was sitting in the window seat, so I closed the window, made sure that nothing scary out there could get to me. I mostly had my eyes closed, trying to run through different breathing techniques and, sort
mm.
of mindfulness techniques that would keep me away from panic. Um,
So so it sounds like you had some resources available to you, because you're talking about some breathing and some mindfulness. So you'd obviously, uh, was that stuff you knew anyway, or had you prepared in some way, even though it was,
Yeah, at that point, I had about 5 years of talk therapy under my belt, just about
mm,
life-related stuff, nothing
mm,
flying specific. But a lot of those resources that my therapist was able to arm me with for different parts of my life did definitely come in handy.
right. Yeah. So that's really interesting. So you were already working on it then, weren't you, without realizing it, because you're just taking a sort of a broader approach to it. It sounds like you weren't going specifically for fear of flying. Okay. That makes sense. So presumably you had to fly back as well. What was that like?
Just about as bad as the way out there, honestly, Paul. With the exception that the last 2 days or so of the trip were completely ruined because I was just worrying about,
Yeah.
getting on that plane.
Yeah.
I remember just going to coffee shops out in Vermont. It was this lovely little town. It was a beautiful day. There was so many things that I could have been doing, but I was sitting there with a cup of coffee in my hand and just sweating and panicking over, what that 2-hour flight was going to look like for me.
Yeah. So no, yeah. Well, that's quite a common thing, as I'm sure you've understand. Okay. So you said that there was two things that happened, and one of them was getting this flight. So what was the other thing that made you go, enough's enough?
The other thing was sort of a once in a lifetime opportunity for me. So I'm a big music fan, big into sort of 1970 rock music. And one of my favorite artists, Brian Eno, announced that he was going to have just a handful of shows across Europe and that he was not coming to the US. So a lot of these old rock and roll guys from the 60s and 70s are kind of on their last leg, musically speaking. So I kind of thought to myself, it's now or never to see this guy. He was playing in, again, just a handful of European cities, but one of them was Berlin. And Germany is one of the places that I've always wanted to go.
Okay.
So I decided this is my chance.
Yeah.
Kind of coupled with that energy of turning 35 and thinking, enough is enough. This felt like a good enough reason to kind of put the pedal to the metal and actually put things into practice.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really interesting. So you've had that experience with your girlfriend Vermont and how that went. You've also got this really positive thing that you're going towards. So you're kind of meeting some of the criteria which I've noticed in people, which is that moment of motivation where you kind of go, do you know what? I'm sick of this. You had the sort of the age thing, the positive thing to go towards, wanting to go to Germany. So there's lots of towards energy there, and then 10 years of crap behind you, isn't there?
Yeah, it was nice to have, putting your eye on the prize definitely helped. So I'm not going to say that I was any sort of, courageous superhero. I did have my girlfriend at the time actually buy the plane tickets for me. It was a little bit too much anxiety to actually click that purchase button. But we did it about 3 months in advance of my trip. So
that was my next question, which is right. So let's see what the lead in. So you've got your trip. So when was the Berlin trip?
The trip was the last week of October.
Okay. All right. So 3 months before that, booked. And then you've had this 3-month time span to do. So talk us through what you did in order. Don't spare any details, Chris. We don't want you cutting it all out. No put any marketing spin on it. Just give us it as it is.
Sure. If I'm being honest, the first month was mostly avoidance. I had this, this grand notion of, the day after I buy these plane tickets, I'm really going to hit the books. I'm going to start looking around for resources. I'll find podcasts, I'll find courses. Maybe I'll, enlist the help of a new therapist, or, maybe go do EMDR, really try to hammer this out of my head. But yeah, the first month was just sort of panic mode about, oh no, this is finally happening. I don't want a repeat of last time. I'm going to be in the air for much, much longer. It's about an 8-hour flight over there. So really just sort of internal panic. The nightmares definitely kept creeping in. And after I knew it, 30 days were gone. And I had 2 months left to prepare.
Yeah. So I see that stage is slightly different to you. So they might call it avoidant. There is one of the behavior change models I'm thinking of, they call it the sort of the pre-contemplation, or the, where you're kind of know you need to do something, but you're kind of just not quite committed to it yet. And it's like a pivotal moment when that sort of switches over. And so after 30 days, what happened then?
After 30 days, that's when I really dug into it. I decided, I would much rather panic about it here while my feet are still firmly on the ground, instead of panicking when I'm, however many thousand feet up in the air over the Atlantic. So I'm a huge podcast excuse me, take that one again. I'm a huge podcast listener, so
Yeah.
I thought that would be the natural first place to go. And the Lovefly podcast was one of the first things that popped up there. So I gave the first couple episodes a listen, thought that, hey, things are pretty good here. Got a nice calming host. So I thought I would dive into it. And I'm somewhat of a completionist, so I like to start things from the very beginning. So I just started from episode 1 and just started working my way through. So I think that I ended up with listening to about 50 of your episodes before I finally got on the plane, and just for every single one of them, just started taking notes for things that I found helpful, and actually filled a decent part of a notebook with it, which I kind of kept on hand when I was eventually on the plane.
Okay. So you literally, you went through the first 50, so that presumably you still got 100 to go, have you? If you're a completionist.
You've really been cranking these out. Good job. So I went through about 50 of them. I downloaded your book, read a couple chapters of that, and then I actually ended up purchasing the course as well, the 30-day course.
Oh yeah.
I ran out of 30 days to complete that, so that's still sitting on my shelf whenever I need it. But
yeah. So you really went for it, didn't you? So you did 50 podcasts. Oh my goodness. So did you do literally the first 50? Because I'm trying to think what we covered in that.
I did.
Also, as it's evolved, I would say I've got more relaxed with it. When I listen, I accidentally listened to some of the early ones, like the really early ones. I was cringing, like, oh my goodness. But it's an evolving thing. That's one of the things I love about doing podcasts, because it's a bit raw. You don't overly edit it unless you particularly want to be ridiculous about it, and so we don't. But you say you suffered 50 of those and the 30-day program. Wow.
I think that kind of the unedited nature of it actually helped, because it just sounded like a conversation between two normal folks. And by the end of it, I thought, hey, if normal people like the ones that are on the Lovefly podcast can go and fly to incredible places, then I guess I can too. So there's a couple episodes in particular that helped me out. The first one was episode 22 with Pete Higgins. During the first maybe 15-20 minutes or so, Pete talks about recommendations for a long flight. And I thought for about 8 hours that my flight was going to be, that would be pretty helpful. So one of Pete's recommendations, and folks can obviously go back and listen to that episode, but one of the recommendations was just make check boxes for each hour and just have an activity in mind for just blocks of time. For the first hour, just kind of take note what's happening around you, know what's going to happen with the plane, what those noises are, what that feeling is, and just kind of get in the mind space and the physical space of being on an airplane. For hour 2, time to look around the cabin, see what's going on with everybody else in there, maybe crack open a book if you want to. So using that technique, I just had a physical checklist for 8 hours. And when an hour passed, I flipped open my notebook, I checked it off and said, okay, I don't have to worry about that first hour anymore. That's behind me. Let's move on to hour 2. And just by dividing the time up like that, it felt like my time in the air went a lot quicker.
I think that's Pete is great. I don't know if you've got his flight checklist as well that he gifted. I don't know if you've seen that.
I've got something like that. There was an episode 46. Captain Steve also went through the stages of flight, so it was kind of a combination of those two that finally helped me wrap my head around what exactly was going on. All those scary noises that I was hearing had some sort of rhyme or reason to them.
So those are the two that you'd recommend. Then 22 and 46. Any others?
Those are the two. Those are the two main ones that helped me. Outside of that, I found that it was really helpful to listen to just average people. You have so many amazing professionals on there, from the cabin crew to the pilots to people, on the ground in the flight tower. But I thought that hearing from just normal people like me was incredibly helpful. There were a few where people just talked about gearing up for very short flights, gearing up for very long flights, and again, it was kind of this notion that everybody else has had their turn to face their fear, to be brave, to go see incredible things across the world, and at some point it just felt like, well, I guess I can do those things too.
Yeah. Well, there you are. So you're part of it now. So you did the podcast, you did our 30-day program. Thank you very much. We're about to relaunch it. Actually, we're redoing it. So, and just because we did it in 30 days, so I literally did a video a day to try and keep it a bit sort of real. But we've gone back over it again and thought, oh, we need to change it. So there's a new version coming out, but I still think the old one seems to be very popular, and it surprised us how many people have committed to it to do the. So when you did the 30-day, have you got any tips around how to make the best of that for those that have done it or are thinking of doing it?
I think the thing is just making it a regular part of your routine. I just found that carving out a little time every single day was what was most helpful, regardless of whether you do it laying in bed, whether you do it first thing in the morning, what the actual curriculum is. I think the most important thing is just kind of treat it like school, honestly. I mean, every one of us listening went through the educational program on one side or the other of the Atlantic. But just kind of making it a consistent, regular thing, hearing people talk about the thing that you're afraid of, purposefully exposing yourself to that, watching videos of the thing that is driving your fear. Just exposure therapy goes a really long way. And I think just making it a habit is what's the most important part.
Yeah, I like that. So anything else that you did? This is great stuff, by the way, Chris. So anything else that you did that in that 2 months that you had?
I think that was mostly it. People kept telling me, "Oh, I'm so excited for your trip. It's going to be so fun for you. I can't wait to hear about X, Y, or Z." I really didn't allow myself to feel any level of excitement until I was physically on the ground in Germany. It was just kind of, I was putting myself through the paces, making sure that I had these kind of mental tools to actually get on that aircraft and, not panic and freak out while I was up there.
Okay, so we'll come to that. So what about for the 2 months? So you did a lot. I mean, there's no small thing doing the podcast. You're doing 50 of them. And also doing as much as the 30-day program as you could. And did you have any nightmares or anything during that time, or any anticipatory anxiety?
Yeah, there were definitely a few nightmares that were creeping up into it, and nothing particularly scary happened in those nightmares. It wasn't like, huge explosions and again, the Hollywood sort of thing. It was just kind of this sinking fear of being sat in an airplane and waiting for takeoff.
Yeah,
that was kind of the driving feeling, was this moment of anticipation, but still with this lingering fear behind it.
Okay, so that was why the reason I asked that is that sometimes people think that they'll do the work and then they'll just be skipping down the jetway to jump on the aircraft, and actually, so you're proof that you were still battling some of those things, thoughts and feelings, and still moving towards it. I think that's really interesting and quite reassuring, isn't it?
There were definitely a few coping mechanisms, even the day of, where I had this huge swell of anxiety, but I was just kind of getting by above the surface. The first thing was that my mother was gracious enough to drive me to the airport, but before we left, I made her hand over the keys so I could physically drive myself there. And that felt like I was taking some sort of ownership over it, saying, I'm purposefully driving toward the airport. I'm not being dragged along. I'm not being dumped off there against my will. So in the future, that's something that I would really like to just not even be on the radar. However you get to the airport is going to be fine one way or the other. But already the morning of, I was sort of trying to take this active role and leaning on these techniques that I thought would keep me safe and keep me confident.
Okay, so that's great. So that was you sort of making a decision, wasn't it, in the moment? So tell us how you then actually did the flight, because you said it was about 8 hours or something like that. So it's no small flight, is it? If you've had that 2-hour horrible one not so long ago. So what was your process in terms of what did you do? How long before did you check in? Walk us through, how you managed.
Sure. So I got to the airport about 3 hours early, just hoping that I had enough time to get through security. Security was maybe 15 minutes of that 3 hours. So unfortunately, I was kind of left to my own devices and to stew in my own anxiety for about 2.5 hours. But what I did with that time was I whipped out a notebook and I started just physically writing down some of those checklists from Pete Higgins and from Captain Steve. So I wrote down physically the stages of flight. So I would have those with me on paper when I was up in the air. So aircraft check, 2 hours pre-flight. Here's what's going on in the cabin crew and on the flight deck. The boarding process, here are the procedures that they're following up there. When the aircraft starts backing up, the engines are starting. What are the noises that you're hearing? What's that rattling? Is that scary? Should they be concerned about that? All that sort of minutia, just being able to write it down, and kind of take control over it is what helped me eventually push past that anxiety. But while I was writing out, this is not my finest handwriting here, Paul. It's a little bit shaky. It's definitely some nerves.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I did for each of those sections is, again, I just made that checkbox next to it.
Yeah.
So after I get on the aircraft, okay, well, that means that the cabin crew and the flight deck have already completed all their checks. I can check that box off and not worry about that anymore. Okay, everybody's on the plane, we're backing up. That means the boarding process is done. Let's go ahead and check that off. Don't need to worry about that anymore either.
I love that. That's really cool. And the fact you're doing that for yourself, aren't you? So you're using some of the wisdom. So how were you when you got on board the aircraft in terms of, how aware of your surroundings and all the rest of it?
Incredibly aware, to a fault, actually. But while I was waiting, one of the recommendations that I got from your podcast was just go speak to somebody at the desk before you start boarding and just let them know, hey, I'm a bit of a nervous flyer. Is there anything that can be done? Should I tip off the cabin crew? So I went up, and there was a lovely gentleman who was working at the desk, and I marched up there and said, hi there, my name's Chris. I'm boarding this flight here soon. I'm a nervous flyer. Just wanted to let you know. And he looked back at me with the just blankest expression, and he says, what do you want me to do about that?
Helpful.
And yeah, very helpful. So I kind of bumbled my way around and said, hey, I just heard this on a podcast. I was hoping that, I would just let somebody know, just, if you see something, say something. And eventually he did turn around and say, hey, you know what? We actually do have a pre-boarding that was going to happen. If you'd like, you can come ahead of all the other groups. You're welcome to go get settled in. But as soon as you get on the plane, definitely let somebody on there know. So I was able to get on a little bit early.
And did that help? Is that something you'd recommend?
It did. The previous flight that I took, where I was incredibly nervous and ended up just this big ball of nerves and tears, I was, I believe, the last person to board that plane. Right. I was terrified to actually, put one foot in front of the other and get on this thing. Yeah. So this notion that I was invited on early and had the opportunity to go get settled in, get my things out of my bag and stow everything away, it really did help. And just being able to sit down in my chair and watch everybody else calmly get on the plane, and their worry is not about safety, their worry is about, hey, is this bag going to fit in the overhead compartment or not? It did a lot to relieve some of that stress.
Yeah, okay, that's good. That's interesting. So you got on board, sat down, watched everyone else come on, and then tell us about how the next 8 hours unfolded. Was there any sort of peaks and troughs?
Yeah, so the first thing that I did, like I said, was kind of consult my flight checklist. Here's what's going on with the plane. Here's the noise that you're hearing. Here's the feeling that you're feeling. Yeah. Once we got up in the air, the captain came over and introduced himself and also said, hey, in about half an hour, we're going to be over Boston and things are going to get a little bit choppy. So that's when the first alarm went off in my head. I whipped out my notebook and I started writing down, oh no, there's going to be turbulence for 45 minutes. We're smooth sailing afterwards, but oh no, what am I going to do about that? So what I ended up doing was pretty much like I've described my little, checkbox situation. So what I wrote down was turbulence timer, and then I made 4 different boxes. There's going to be 40 minutes of turbulence, so I have 4 boxes here. After the first 10 minutes, I'll check off the first box. 20 minutes, check off the second one, and so forth.
I love it. I haven't heard anyone do that, but that is a really smart thing to do, isn't it? Just to break it down. So here's a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, did the turbulence arrive as promised?
It didn't.
Yeah. Okay. So that's sod's law. That's what we say. So the other question then is that I often ask, sometimes when I remember to ask, would you prefer to know at the beginning of the flight, like that captain did, and say, hey, there might be some chop, even if it doesn't arrive, or would you prefer just to not know at all? What's your preference?
Go back and forth on this. As soon as he said there was going to be turbulence, my mind just went back to that trip flying from LA into Las Vegas where, oh no, there's going to be turbulence, and now I'm going to panic and freak out about it. Yeah. But I think just because I had that point of comparison, it was terrifying for me to have it sprung on me. Maybe having a little bit of warning ahead of time will be better. Okay. And it gave me just enough time to think about what my plan was when the turbulence did arrive. And again, that plan was making my little checkbox system. But really, I think that having a little bit of forewarning at least gives you those time to access those resources that you've built up ahead of time. So you've got those ready and raring to go when the turbulence does hit.
So, and the turbulence didn't arrive. Did you go and complain? Where's my turbulence?
I thought about it.
I've got checkboxes. Fifth one, no turbulence. Tick.
For all the mental anguish you put yourself through, it doesn't end up happening. Yeah, I felt a little cheated out of it, honestly.
Yeah, you should get some sort of money back. Where's my bloody turbulence?
A voucher. Yeah.
Yeah, free drink on landing. So so you went through the flight. You had already decided what you were going to do per hour. Were you able to do that? Did you do that?
I found out that I didn't even need the checklist for the most part. Things just kind of came naturally. But it was nice to have a plan to fall back on. Right. So my list included things like, play a video game for 1 hour, read a book for 2 hours, watch a 3-hour movie, things of that nature. So in the end, I mostly just ended up listening to podcasts and looking out the window, but it was nice to sort of have the fallback in case of emergency.
Hang on a second, Chris. Looking out the window. Let's just not pass that. Earlier on, remember, we had the blind down in case anything scary came at you. And now you're looking out the window. What's going on?
Nothing gets past you, Paul. Yeah. I think part of accepting the inherently safe nature of flight was not just understanding that, hey, this machine that we're on is perfectly safe. It's going to go through its own motions to get us over there. Yeah. But it was also really confronting the idea that, hey, you're several thousand feet up in the air right now. Once again, perfectly safe, but also let's really soak it in. Let's see what it's like out there. Yeah. And it turns out, at least in my brain, looking out and just seeing the sun coming up over the clouds was it was beautiful. It's something that I hadn't seen for over 10 years of my life. And just being able to look out the window with intention and see that was it. The previous time that I cried on an airplane was out of panic. This time it kind of brought a tear to my eye because I was seeing something that you just don't get to see in your day-to-day unless your feet are off the ground.
No, there's something it's very easy to take it for granted when you fly all the time. But when you don't fly for a while and then you go and do it and you look out and you go, wow, these views, look down on cities, see sunrises, sunsets, all this stuff. It's just phenomenal. And that's just something you kind of reminded me that the sheer beauty that there is, isn't there? And how lucky we are really to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's I really owed it to myself after 10 years of avoiding it to really just take it for what it was worth. And
Yeah.
it was just incredible. It really was. If next time I fly, I'm definitely going to try to get a window seat as well, because I'd really like to look out there again.
And I love the language there. Next time I fly. There was no if. That's what I like to hear. You know, that's really positive, affirmative language, isn't it? You know, next time I fly, I can look out the window. And I do think there is something about being in the moment, because there's this thing I've been wrestling with, and I know some people won't like this, but I'm going to say it. The noise cancelling headphones for, you know, people have said, you know, so I can pretend I'm not on an aircraft. And I kind of go, I can get it if you don't like the sound, you just want to be distracted, that's fine. Or perhaps you just like the peace and quiet. I get that. But pretending I'm not on the aircraft is almost robbing yourself of the next level of experience that you've just described, isn't it? So you're numbing yourself to it, and rather than going towards it, embracing it. So I'd say anyone who's using noise cancelling headphones because you want to pretend you're not on an airplane, take one ear off and just, experiment.
Yeah, it's, as long as you're able to get on an airplane confidently and complete the journey, I think that's wonderful. I think it definitely comes in stages, though, because if you're on there, you're wearing the noise canceling headphones. Truth be told, I still wore my noise canceling headphones. It was mostly just so I could listen to music.
Oh, thank God I didn't say put my foot in my mouth there.
But, I think that you only truly overcome a fear when you can face it head on. And I think that if you are leaning into disassociation or avoidance, then there's always more work to do. You've taken one major step forward, but you've kind of got your target on the next thing that you can work on.
Yeah, I feel like I've given you a bit of a kick in now, because I'm saying, but yeah, I do agree. It is about doing what you can manage, and then the next time doing a bit more, doing it, because it's a never-ending thing, isn't it? So then if you choose to wear the noise cancelling headphones or the eye masks or whatever, or shut the blinds, that's the choice. But when the choice is made for you, then there's still work to be done. So you're really well on the way, aren't you? So you appreciate that. So tell me, what was landing like for you, and then the rest of the time that you were there, how was that?
Landing, for as much anxiety and fear as I've always had around flying, the landing has always been my favorite part, because, hey, if something horrible happens, at least we're on the ground for it.
Yeah, we survived another one.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Ooh. The only worry that I had this time was, the notion that, maybe something was happening on the runway where we'd have to do a go around.
Okay.
So that was kind of the primary worry as we were approaching the ground was, let's get these wheels firmly on terra firma, and let's get this vacation on with. But had a very smooth landing, got into Germany. It was a nasty rainy day, so not much to look forward to that morning, but I physically cheered when we hit the ground, because I was able to look out the window and say, I just crossed an ocean. I crossed a 10-year fear. I crossed an ocean, and now I'm finally over here. And it just felt like such an immensely personal achievement.
Yeah.
Even putting aside all the things that I was looking forward to doing on the vacation. So even though it was nasty and rainy outside, it was still nice and sunny and bright in my head.
Yeah, I like that. That's a proper moment there, isn't it? Where you've thought something and you did that. Even from the moment you drove yourself to the airport, you were making decisions differently and deciding to embrace things, move towards it, window blinds up, 4 checkboxes for the duration of turbulence. You're moving towards stuff. That's just amazing. And so you were there over in Berlin for how long?
Just a week. It was a pretty quick trip, but I managed to pack in a lot of fun while I was there. I bought sort of an all-inclusive pass, so I just kind of forced myself to go to tons of museums, do all these tours, meet a bunch of people, go to great new restaurants, and just see all the history that's packed there in the city. So it was
it's
just
an awesome city, isn't it?
incredible. I can't wait to go back when the weather's a little bit nicer.
Yeah, no, I love Berlin, and the people fantastic. Yeah, just fabulous city, one of my favorites, And what about knowing you had to fly back? Was there any sort of anticipatory anxiety during the week you were there, or any dread at all or anything?
I hate to make myself sound like Superman, but really there was
Here we
none.
go.
There was none. I flew out on Saturday morning. Friday, absolutely no anxiety. My number one concern was where I'm going to be able to find another good doner kebab in the city. I was completely in the moment, not worried at all. There was some anxiety around navigating the bus system and public transit to make sure I actually, got to my flight on time. But yeah, in the way of anxiety about the actual flight, nothing, because I feel like I've kind of already done the work. I understood what I needed to do to reach a level of peace with it. And I, had it sitting in my notebook waiting for me when I got on the plane.
I love that. That's brilliant. Where can I find the doner kebab? That's the biggest worry. Well, that is a certain time in the evening. That is a concern. That is a major priority.
It gets a little dicey, yeah.
So what about the flight back? How was it?
Flight back was great. I managed to get in a couple hours of sleep, woke up and there was just a little bit of turbulence. And I just thought to myself, hey, it's kind of nice to be rocked to sleep. And
what's happened to you?
I don't know. I don't know who I am anymore, Paul. I look in the mirror and it's the same face, but I feel like a different person.
Amazing. Sleeping as well. Did you eat on the flight?
They
go to the toilet, go to walkabout. I mean, this is all the stuff of dreams, isn't it? Eh?
It really is. Yeah, they brought lunch out for us. I did manage to go to the restroom. I found the courage. The flight over there, I wouldn't dare get out of my seat. As much as I talk a big game, I still wanted to be firmly planted. But yeah, on the flight back, I figured, why not? Let's get up. Let's go visit the lavatory. Let's enjoy the meal. Let's stretch our legs a little bit. So
even between the first and second flight, there's some significant improvement, isn't there? Crikey.
Yeah, I just figured if I'm going to do this, I want to do it 100%. I don't want there to be any limitations for myself while I'm conquering this. So
amazing. What a great story that was, honestly. And thank you for doing the detail, because I thought you were going to be a little bit reductionist then. You give me the big picture. I went there, so thank you for doing the detail, because that's the stuff which really helps people. It's like, what was your process?
Yeah.
And so what's next for you then in terms of flying?
You're going to love this one, Paul.
Private pilot's license. All right.
I've got a friend who does have her private pilot's license, and we chatted a little bit before my trip, and she said, "Oh, things are easy once you get up there." I'm like, "Yeah, well,
be careful now. Geeta's going to be onto you. She'll be nabbing you for her little school. Geeta's school." Yeah.
So next steps for me is I have actually already booked my next flight, and it's in just about 3 weeks.
And
I am going to visit some family. It's a little bit of a spontaneous trip, but I figured I would like to keep things in motion while I've still got this big well of courage inside of me. So I'll be making, it's a pretty short trip compared to the transatlantic one, just a few hours, but I figured strike while the iron's hot.
No, I agree. And it's important to cement the learning, isn't it? And just keep reinforcing it. Oh, I love that. So I'm going to push you for one more thing, because this story's been great with packed with tips and stuff. But if you had to kind of do a sum up, and you've noticed this as you've listened to 50 of the podcasts, always ask people at the end, kind of, what's your little bit of wisdom or gift of hope that you would give to anybody who's listening, thinking, yeah, it's all right for you, mate, but what about me?
I think the biggest thing is just that when you decide to overcome your fear of flying, you are tackling a huge challenge. And I would encourage people, just be gentle with yourself, because you might see other people who say, oh, it was so simple, for them to do it, but here I am dealing with this massive ball of anxiety. It's when you have a fear like that, it becomes so deep-seated and so tangled, and untangling it takes intention, and it takes time more than anything. My recommendation for people is just try to make it doesn't need to be part of your everyday, but just try to make it part of your regular life. Whether it's listening to a podcast once a week while you're on a walk, or sitting down for a video, once every couple weeks or so. Just try to find time in your schedule where you can fit it in. Doesn't need to be an hour or two, can just be 10, 15 minutes here or there. But really just try to make it part of your everyday. And when you expose yourself to it, just time and time again, it starts to feel a little bit less scary, a little bit more doable. And eventually, unlike me, you're going to be able to click that button that says, buy this ticket to wherever you want to go with a little bit more confidence.
Yeah, love that. And I'm assuming, did you buy this next ticket yourself?
I did.
There we go. See, we just more movement. Oh, what a great story, Chris. Thank you so much. There were some really lovely bits there, and it's the process that you went through and breaking it down, and your whole thought process was fascinating to listen to. And literally, I think somebody who's might be struggling could go, well, I actually quite like that. There's some bits that they could just use, straight away. Amazing. Thank you.
It's again, sure thing, anytime. And again, just thank you and the folks who've been on the podcast are just so helpful. I mean, I've just got tons and tons of notes here from all sorts of episodes.
Oh, wow.
And every single one of them was just so instrumental in getting me to where I am now. So I've got this flight coming up here in a couple of weeks, and then next year my mom turns 70, so we're going to fly out to Yosemite, and she's always wanted to see all the national parks while she's still able to. So I've got a couple trips in the books, and I really have you to thank for it.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you and gracious. That's very gracious of you. However, you did the work. You said we put the stuff out there. You've grabbed it and used it. Your self-drive and commitment has made the difference, because some people will sample some of the podcasts and say, oh, I've listened to the podcast and nothing's working. But I think you can't just listen passively. You've got to be active, like you were doing notes, because I think there's nuggets in every single episode. The way that's, whether it's a true story from somebody or whether it's an expert, there's always something that you can get if you just give yourself permission to listen out for it and be ready for it. And people aren't always necessarily ready, but you clearly turned the corner and just thought, that's enough. Brilliant, honestly. Thank you. Oh, amazing. Thank you very much, mate. That was just top.
Thank you, Paul. I'm so super excited. It really does feel like I've turned a corner in my life, and I've got all sorts of other things I need to tackle in my personal life, but this was a huge one. And maybe I can go see some prettier parts of the world and do some more of that untangling on the other stuff while I'm on a beach or something. So
yeah, exactly. No, that's phenomenal.